Good afternoon. Now it's working. Thank you, Melanie. Good afternoon. Welcome to the International Center for Jefferson Studies. We're so glad you could be here today. My name is John Ragasta. I'm the acting director here at ICJS. And we do many things here at ICJS between our archaeology department, our library, the papers of Thomas Jefferson, our Getting Word project. But we are so thrilled to have the opportunity to host scholars, those who come here as fellows and study for a month or 9 months, as the case may be, but also scholars who come to talk to us about their work. And I'm especially pleased today to be able to introduce Patrick Griffin, who is returning to Charlottesville on one of his many important books that he has written. Patrick is a historian of colonial America and modern Britain and Ireland. And so he has a very interesting perspective on these issues. And I love his description of this book. It's about violence, liberation, and war. So it's a good trilogy of topics, but he's going to be talking to us about how the various nations interacted in the age of Atlantic Revolution. And he today is going to be joined by Frank Cogliano. Many of you know Frank. Frank is a professor at the University of Edinburgh. He is the incoming director of the International Center for Jefferson Studies this summer. We'll look forward to that. Patrick is currently at Notre Dame, and we'll see if I can get this right, the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, and has published a number of books before the age of Atlantic Revolution. Most importantly, from my perspective, Leviathan, which is an important book about the frontier, but also, interestingly, The People with No Name. And I may have a question about that when we're done. But thank you for being here. We will have some questions and answers after we're done, but Patrick and Frank are going to lead us in a conversation about this book.
Thank you, John, and welcome everybody. And welcome, Patrick. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation with one of my dearest friends, Professor Griffin. Patrick, you've just published this book. And I've got a few questions for you. One thing I should say before we start, Patrick's actually giving a public lecture tomorrow night at the University of Virginia. And it is not on this book, so he's on a tour, so you don't want to miss it. And so, if you like what you hear tonight, you should come tomorrow, and it's on his next book.
Or if you don't like what you hear tonight, please come tomorrow because it's going to be a lot better. Yeah.
So let's talk about the current book, Patrick, "The Age of Atlantic Revolution." Why this book? Where did you start?
Well, the short answer is I think I'm a masochist, but I think the long answer is I was simply just approached by the press and said, hey, we'd really like someone who can try to take this on, and in really just a fit of I don't know what, I just decided to draft a proposal for it. And it was just based upon the things that I knew at the time and where I happened to be and the way that I was thinking about revolution and how that was changing with my work. And so I dashed something off. Right. And so it went out right away to 3 reviewers. And one reviewer came back and said, I love this. This is fantastic. Can't wait to see the book. Another one says, well, I'll wait to see what the book is like. Maybe it has some promise, but we'll have to see. Third, hated it. And then the press said, we want it. And so it's fine. So that's how the book, in all fairness, really got going. But it for me was just sort of a logical growth of where I was going and what I was thinking about. I had found myself reading some essays about the Atlantic world. So like John was saying, I'm a guy who does colonial America. I do stuff in the old world too. And so I like to think of myself as an Atlanticist. But we were all talking about the ways that the Atlantic world is hived off into different sort of like national stories. You have a British Atlantic world, a French Atlantic world, a Spanish Atlantic world, a Luso or Portuguese Atlantic world, and never the twain shall meet. They don't really interact that much. And I decided, well, let me see if I can apply some of the things I've done before and think about the broader whole and try to make sense of this space.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Anybody who writes on the Atlantic world, especially revolution in the Atlantic world, has to grapple with R.R. Palmer.
Yeah.
And this book is mercifully shorter than Palmer's 2 volumes. But can you situate it in the broader literature?
Yeah, Palmer, of course, magisterial work and kind of just has really, in many ways, defined the field. And he, along with the French scholar Jacques Gaudichaud, were the two who really kind of laid out the broad parameters. And to be quite honest with you, the rest of us are just writing footnotes, not so much for the two volumes that he did, but I think the idea that they generated together about kind of thinking about the whole and how they are connected. And I found myself, as I was imagining this, necessarily have to grapple with Palmer. That said, the interpretation's a bit different. So Palmer was writing really the height of the Cold War. And in many ways, he was trying to think about the age of revolution in light of those global tensions at the time. Understandably so. We all write about kind of our own times. And he was at pains to say that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were really yoked together. And to a certain extent, he was refuting kind of Marxist ideas about revolution of the grand revolutionary tradition, thinking about the French Revolution necessarily being kind of arm in arm with Russia and then China. And that the American Revolution, that's kind of either a junior varsity revolution or just a war of independence, but it wasn't a real revolution. And those people who study revolution know as much. And Palmer was saying, no, wait a minute. You have to understand the way that these two actually work together and the way that they function together. And they were both propelled by a set of ideas or ideals that were premised upon the ideas of democracy. So they were democratic revolutions. So very much ideas kind of are at the fore, but he's writing at a period where kind of ideas matter, and there's a great deal at stake with these ideas. And so I don't reject ideas at all. I just kind of come at it from a different perspective. I try to look at broader processes. And the way that I understand it is people have like a menu of different ideas they can draw upon to make sense of everything that's happening around them. And in the process, they tend to reshape their worlds. And that was kind of like the jumping off point. So like I said before, maybe it's a very long footnote, but it is in many ways a footnote to the work that was done by Palmer so long ago.
Well, you're in the right place for this because, of course, Jefferson believed that the American and French revolutions were part of the same global movement for liberty. So Palmer is in good company and you're in good company. I'm interested in your subtitle. The Fall and Rise of a Connected World. Why is it not the rise and fall of a connected world?
Oh, well, that's my stupid way maybe of being clever. But what I wanted to do was more or less just kind of like turn full circle. So revolution in the 18th century, of course, meant moving from one point, really coming back to a same kind of point. And what I was at pains to say, and the pains in this book to say, is that the world that kind of gave rise to the age of Atlantic Revolution was a hyper-connected world, and I'll talk about that in just one more moment. But at the end of it, it was still a hyper-connected world, maybe even more connected than it had ever been before, only those connections were managed differently. And so it, in many ways, kind of, it gave the age more or less put to bed an older notion of connection, but gave rise to a new notion of connection. And connection was kind of like, for me anyway, the be-all and end-all as I thought about everything that was going on. I was just absolutely amazed. I mean, see, Professor Elijah Gould is in the audience there, who's written some really kind of foundational stuff on this when it came to kind of entanglements and the ways of thinking about the imperial period. And that was really instrumental and very helpful for me as I thought about it. But I'm coming from that same vantage point. Connection is all important, and understanding connection, and once you do, it explains the period.
So there's a lot to unpack there. This is a book about empire. Yeah. It's a book about revolution. As John said in his introduction, it's a book about violence. Are empire and revolution in tension with each other?
No, I think that it was empires and the crisis of empires, and this is where I call a crisis of connection. There was connections were kind of exploding across the Atlantic world in the 18th century in kind of scope and scale in ways they hadn't before. Imperial states that were in place were trying to manage these, understand them, comprehend them, make sense of them, harness them, lasso them, stop them. Just anything to try to kind of figure out what was happening in this really increasingly anarchic space. And that is kind of how revolutions, as the book suggests, begins. It has to do with kind of the problems of connections and the inability of empires as they were constituted then to be able to manage all of these connections. And so it's really the world of empire gives way to kind of or an age of empire gives way to an age of reform, which gives way to an age of revolution. But in the meantime, and this is where they're tied in too, you have new imperial forms that are created through this age also. It's not that it's not this, I think the simple way we think about it is you have on the one hand, a world of empires gives way to a world of nation states, right? That's kind of a conventional way. And there's a great deal of truth to that. But the world of empire also gives way to a renewed world of empire. And so the two are kind of, I think, inextricably bound. That revolution, if you will, is sort of like the transition from an older one that couldn't manage connected space to a new world of nation states and reinvigorated empires that could manage the connections that define the space.
So in the old formulation, one often would read in the kind of traditional view in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, that some historians advanced, especially American historians, was that republicanism and revolution is antithetical to empire. What I'm hear you saying, Patrick, is that republicanism is a form of empire, a new form of empire that emerges in this interconnected world?
Well, Professor Keough-Naughton, the author of Emperor of Liberty, I think you of all people should know this. And in this place that we sit, we're right at the seat of kind of an American empire, that's for sure. I think in many ways, as we know now, and this is where actually John, Professor Ragosta talked about my time here at UVA, where it was really, really fundamental, still is instrumental in lots of ways to, I think, about these sorts of things. And that we know is that kind of the American Republican experiment, we know, goes hand in hand with an understanding of empire, a very different, I think, understanding of empire than we had before. But no, there's nothing antithetical about Republican forms. Maybe rhetorically there is, but certainly as they act on the ground, not necessarily so.
Interesting. Thank you for reminding me about my own work.
Anytime.
It's never wrong to pander, remember that. So Patrick, in your work, and I've learned a huge amount from reading your work over the years, place is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And one of the things that strikes me about this book is you're expanding the space in which the age of Atlantic Revolution takes place. So although it's shorter than Palmer's work, it's actually more comprehensive in certain ways. So we have Chile, we have Haiti, both of which were missing from Palmer.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that, the importance of space in this work, but space to your work more generally? And I'll say this parenthetically, Patrick and I spent a long time traipsing around London recently for his new book, the current project you're working on that he'll be discussing tomorrow. That's foreshadowing, people. And visiting spaces that were central to that work. So I know space is important to you. So could you elaborate on this?
Thankfully for this new book, that often involves lots of pubs that we would necessarily go to for,
We're being live streamed, Patrick. So
yeah. But no, space and place are so important. Like you say, let's talk first about it. It's a big question. The first one has to do with Palmer. I think that critics today, when they look at Palmer's work, they say that it was kind of insufficiently broad, that it left a lot of kind of really critically important aspects of the broader age of revolution necessarily out. So some people said right away, what about Latin America? What about that experience? And there's some people would say, well, that's sort of a coda, that's an epilogue to what actually happens. And maybe you could make the case, this book doesn't, it says that it was fundamentally part of it. But I think more glaringly, probably Haiti, the case of Haiti now, whereas before, people, I just think, more or less kind of overlooked it for all different kinds of reasons, many not so good, that they overlooked Haiti and didn't think that it really was part and parcel of this story. Well, this book tries to say, no, wait a minute. If you want to understand the period, Haiti is at the very heart of everything that's going on. It is, I would say, by far the most hyper-connected place in the broader Atlantic because it was the richest parcel of ground in the world. That's where it was. Square mile per square mile, it was an extraordinarily wealth-generating space, and because of it, it was bound to all of these places by licit and, more importantly, illicit trade, both in sugar and, of course, in human beings. And because of that, it's far from being one that's just kind of an add-on or a tack-on. It becomes sort of a central part of the story, And so I think that's one way that space is important. So getting back to what I talked about before, when we think about these different Atlantic worlds, we do an injustice to the period, and I think we fail to understand actually the dynamics at work when we kind of hive one off from the other and say there's a British Atlantic story, a French Atlantic story, et cetera, et cetera. No, they need to be integrated to understand them because you got to understand how bound, or as Professor Gould would say, how entangled all of these empires and all these spaces really, really are. But there's another reason for space too. And if you read in the book, particularly in the last chapter, I've been to many of these places, and that's kind of consciously so. And when I would be invited for conferences or give talks or do other kinds of things, or conferencing, as we've done a number of times together, I would always go out hunting monuments, hunting out things that really this age was about. And at first, it's just something that I just loved to do because it just made me feel connected to these places. Like the great historian C.V. Woodward once said, you can't write about a place unless you've been there. And I really do subscribe to that. I think kind of going to these places have really shaped the way that I do history and the way that I think about things, because all of a sudden then it's not so much I become part of the place, but then I can realize it on a human scale, and it just kind of humanizes the writing. But it also allows you to see interpretive possibilities in what you see around you. So in the final chapter is a chapter on the memorialization of the age, what I consider to be the glue that kind of rebinds everything that had frayed before. And so much of this is based upon these places that I went visiting and seeing. And that's kind of an important element of the book. And that thinking, far from just being kind of an icing on the cake, was the kind of experimentation that actually allowed me to make the cake itself. The book wouldn't be what it is, and I wouldn't have made sense of the connections unless I went out and seen the places that were so bound together and started to see the parallels and started to see how one drew upon the other. And so I think for any historian, I think, we got to get out there. We got to see these places. We have to go and we got to touch things. We have to feel things in order to get kind of a sense of truly what went on. And I subscribe to that. Otherwise, it's, I don't think we come up with the most compelling kinds of interpretations.
Again, perfectly welcome sentiment, given that we're at a major historic site and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in fact. So, yeah, those of you who are watching online, come and visit. Patrick Griffin says you've got to get out there. Now, let me ask you let me push you a little further on this. And I should say, Patrick and I were at a conference in Santiago, and we went to find, we went to find a statue, a monument to Bernardo O'Higgins, the great Chilean patriot and revolutionary. But there was massive unrest. In fact, one could say it was an interconnected world that was rather anarchic in its violence. And there was a pretty substantial police presence around this statue. And we approached it several times and asked, and Patrick said, we just want to take a picture of it. And we nearly got arrested. So he puts his money where his mouth is when it comes to visiting these places. Are space and place the same thing in your thinking?
So it's kind of at the general and the local, I think about it, and so I don't think it's, again, it gets back to like your question you had about empire and revolution. I don't necessarily think they're in conflict, and they're not either or at all, and I think more universal. This is the cool thing when you go to places, if we can use it, think about the local. They're the local manifestations of broader themes, and if there's one phrase that's overused throughout in this book, and I apologize for that, it's variation on a common theme, because that's what I was seeing everywhere. Especially when you go to these places, you begin to realize, oh my Lord, this is just the same as happening up in the United States, but in a different kind of way. The register is a little bit different. The cast of characters is different, but the same kinds of dynamics are occurring. And you're struck by kind of the parallels. So someone like Bernardo O'Higgins, in many ways, is this character then who clearly you can understand him not only as a Simon Bolivar, and some people would compare the two together, but also as a Napoleon, or as a Jefferson, for that that matter too. And so when you go down and you see these, that's why it's not just kind of like mindlessly almost getting arrested, as we almost were, trying to see the statue. By the way, the Chilean cops don't kid around, when they playing the ignorant American, saying you just want to get a picture, no dice at all. They weren't having anything of it. But that's, by going out and seeing these places and that's why I wanted to get a picture, because on this famous statue, it's a famous statue on O'Higgins on a horse galloping, and he's trampling a Spanish soldier with brandishing his sword. And say, oh my God, there's a lot you can make on that. But there's reliefs, there's reliefs around the edge of it, and I really wanted to get to see those. And later on, I was able to discover these are more or less the story of O'Higgins, just like we have the story of like George Washington, in many kinds of ways, and how in the period just after the age, when people are trying to put all the unrest to bed, they're creating mythic conceptions, and it's happening everywhere. It's happening for the victors of the age and the vanquished of the age. It's happening for all these people who just graduate from this period of profound tumult. They're all invested in the same nation-building projects. And they're, like I say, they're variations on common themes. So getting back to your point, you only see this if you start looking at the place, the local, but then relating it to the broad or what you would regard as the universal. And that's, to me, is the exciting thing. As I tell my students, every day when you're writing, right, you got to go up the mountaintop and you got to survey the forest for the trees, like standard kind of history thinking. But then you got to get down and you got to know what that bark feels like. And it's the trip between the two where the exciting thinking happens, and I think the book hopefully reflects all of that.
I think it does, but I think I want to pursue this a little bit further, if you'll indulge me, because I think if one looks at the body of your work, not just this book, but the other works you've written, you've kind of alternated between the big picture, space, as you've called it, right, and place, kind of quite focused work. So the immediate predecessor to this book was your book, The Townsend Moment, about the Townsend brothers and the crisis of the British Empire in the late 18th century. And I know the one you're working on is, again, another, it's not quite a micro history, but it's focused on an individual who's operating in this space that you've described. But this book is a sort of 30,000 foot view. And then, so you've alternated. Do you want to comment on that methodology? Is this a deliberate choice, or why have you done this?
Well, I could give you a real highfalutin answer, okay? Which I'll give you the highfalutin answer in a minute, which means this is rationalization. The truth is more sordid about it, and this is the kind of the ebb and flow of a career. The truth was, at that point, I was chair of the history department. You know what I mean? 6 years of my life exactly. I will never get back. Tough work. But that's not the kind of work that lends itself to kind of like doing, I think, big, broad things. And I wanted to, I just said, I need to have a focused project that allows me to go to X amount of archives in places that I tended to go with. And so I just decided, I always was fascinated about these two brothers. And so I just said, can I tell a story of kind of like the rise of empire, how empire in the 18th century comes to be, and then how empire begins to kind of dissolve, with the origins of the American Revolution. And I was able to do that in a contained way. But all right, the highfalutin answer is that it's kind of like a drilled down case study where I'm taking some things that I've been working with, and just sometimes it has to do with questions that arise from your previous work that you really haven't particularly fully investigated yet, but still you want to answer, and you're just fascinated by those kinds of things. And so you have this itch you got to scratch. And I think that's why I'll go down and do these kind of core sample projects like the Townsends, and like the new one that I'm working on, I'll be talking about tomorrow. It's about kind of the creation of global systems, but just look at one person. This, however, is where, okay, I think I know how I've done enough of this kind of sampling and drilling down. Now let me just try, as you put it, to get some altitude, right? And get some altitude and try to tell sort of a broader story, but there are two different ways. But one is actually, here's the other reason, one's therapy for the other. After you've been living with people for a while, after you're doing some quasi-biographical work, you either kind of, you become captivated by them, or you start to really resent them and hate them after a while. There's a little bit of both, and what this does, it allows you then to kind of get away from it and just kind of, I think, doing the work of an historian. And then, but after a while, you say this can become abstract. And it's always fun to go, by that point, you're hungry to drill down again and try something different.
So do you prefer one to the other?
Whatever I'm working on, I prefer. So it's just like, honestly, right now, the project I'm working on, I'm just so transfixed with. I love what I'm doing, and that's the excitement and that fire in the belly that really gets you up in the morning and wanting to do more of it. Whereas what I've done before, I never even think about again. It's just like, what? Just that's in the rearview mirror. But it's just the way I operate, I think. Yeah.
So I want to talk about the last chapter about the memorials,
yeah,
and the memorialization, because this, again, is a theme in a lot of your work. If one thinks back to American Leviathan, you begin that book by looking at a memorial in Ohio, if memory serves. Would you agree with the statement that these revolutions only have meaning because they're memorialized?
Yes and no. That's a tough question, Frank. I thought this was going to throw me some easy hanging curveballs here. Didn't expect this wicked slider on the outside corner. Yes and no. I think the memorialization was the attempt, I think anyway, in there, of the state to kind of wrap itself in the legitimacy of what had just happened. Okay, and you think about just everything we associate with Thomas Jefferson, so much of what we associate with George Washington. These myths were really created sometimes by them, but more often than not by others anyway, who wanted to use these images, and they were always robed kind of in the notion of the period that these guys featured in. And so you cannot think of Jefferson, you cannot think of Washington outside of the revolution. And so to a certain extent, many of the myths, and ours, the myth that we have is really the myth of the founding fathers, what we have to kind of, if you will, make sense of our revolution. All other places have them too. And so to a certain extent, the memorials, when you walk, like for example, around the city of Paris, right? If you've been to Paris and you're walking around and say you're starting at the Champs-Élysées, right? And you're looking there from the Arc de Triomphe and you're looking toward the Louvre, you are living, and that is a space that's been carved out. With time, it would be carved out to really kind of instruct you, the walker and the viewer, about what the revolution was and what the revolution means. And actually, much of Paris itself is kind of laid out in a way in cruciform. If you go right to where the crossing is, Place de la Concorde, you're standing at a space that has been redefined by revolution. Then on either arm, there are these spaces also that speak to the Revolution of France. So when you just walk the city itself, okay, to a certain extent, you are to understand what this revolution meant and what the state that constructed it, what the state can do. And the same thing happens, I think, when you walk around Washington, D.C. These places are consciously constructed to do this kind of work. And so in that regard, it's difficult to disentangle revolution from the memorialization that went on with it. But what it also does, and this is the other part, this is why your question is so good, so hard to tussle with, is these things often sanitize what had happened before. Not only do they remember certain key aspects, or encourage us to remember certain key aspects, they also encourage us to forget certain things. That's what memorials do. They help us remember, they help us to forget. And that's what, no matter where you are throughout the broader Atlantic world, that's indeed the work that they're doing. So it's always an incomplete revolution. It's a sanitized revolution because, first and foremost, monuments use revolution, but use revolution to sustain order.
Is that a contradiction?
It is in our mind, because when you think of revolution, you think revolution is anything but order. And if you read the middle chapters of the book about kind of how revolutions in this period worked, how they worked through networks and how they sustained hopes, the ideas that were coursing through the Atlantic and that people embraced, how they sustained fears, that also was and also how they sustained aggression, how warfare was sustained because of the networks. And all three are part and parcel of revolution. And of course, hopes, unbounded hopes, unbridled freedom, and all-out aggression. These are not the kinds of things that sustain order. So revolutions itself is anything but order. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to come up with just a few words that would define it, you would think of fear, disorder, chaos, but liberation too. All of these kinds of things are thrown in the hopper of what a revolution can mean. But afterward, this is the difficult task that states had. The difficult task was they had to use this mess that was revolution, where a lot of people had extraordinary high hopes for what the period would present to them. Also, they had very kind of fully realized fears as well. And out of this stuff, you got to kind of create the stuff of a nation. Then that's not easy to do. And so the two would seem contradictory, but that's what the monuments do. And that's why they have to remember certain aspects and to forget other aspects, because you're only taking those parts of revolution that are going to serve the purpose of order.
So do monuments tame revolutions and kind of remove their most dangerous aspects.
Without doubt, and that's it. They're kind of, as put it, they're covenants, if you will, that are created. They're lowest common denominators, and they always include certain people and certain kinds of values and virtues, and exclude at the same time, all to create a lowest common denominator of order. That's what they do.
So do they do us a disservice as historians because they leave things out, crucial parts of the story?
They definitely leave crucial parts of the story out. That's our job, is to kind of move beyond the myth. It's very easy for all of us to kind of be captured by the myth of what went on, but our job as historians is, to a certain extent, we're myth busters, not in an iconoclastic kind of way, and not to kind of like just lay bare how myths are not true. Myths may be true in a kind of a capital T sense or something. They may speak to broader kinds of truths, but they always speak to kind of the pacts that we create among ourselves to sustain some semblance of belonging, and usually to sustain some sort of order. It doesn't mean, by the way, that they're just. In many cases, clearly from this age, many of them are unjust.
Fascinating. There's so much to unpack here. I do want to throw it open to the audience, but I've got one more for you, Patrick. If you take the 30,000-foot view, and if we see O'Higgins in Santiago and Washington all over the United States, or Jefferson, if we're you do a wonderful job of giving us a view of the whole Atlantic world. And it's a real strength of the book. But does that undermine the uniqueness of these revolutions? You're establishing connectivity, and I'm not saying it's not as simple as, is this an attack on American exceptionalism or Chilean exceptionalism or Haitian exceptionalism? But is that not a consequence of this approach? And do we lose nuance as a result? Do we pay a price for that?
I would say no, because what it does, I think the book tries to tussle with that and helps us, maybe gives a new understanding of the rise of American exceptionalism, or Chilean exceptionalism, or French exceptionalism at the time of the revolution. It's just a different way of understanding that there's nothing exceptional about these exceptionalisms. And we Americans will kind of, flagellate ourselves with, oh my God, American exceptionalism awful. No, it's everyone in here. You read this book, they all come up with ideas of nation that are somehow exceptional. But what I discovered, and this is the cool thing, because the moment that you're talking about the whole, it doesn't only lend you to write what we call like kind of a systemic study of looking how the system works. There's plenty of that too. But it also demands a comparative study. And it means that if you're looking at the American Revolution, then you look next at France, then you look next at Haiti, then you look at what happened in Ireland, and you're looking at all these various places. And I think what it does is it allows you to kind of still get that particularity, but then you're holding that particularity up against another set of particularities. Okay, so I would say that at its best, like this kind, I don't know if this does it or not, but it certainly aspires to do it. It doesn't try to kind of dumb down or try to just homogenize everything. Actually, it just does the opposite, because it tries to explain, getting back to where your first question started with Palmer, that the American Revolution was indeed a revolution, but the American Revolution cohered to its own social dynamics, and it cohered to the constraints of American history, of the American past. And if you will, the disorder of revolution was going to be channeled through all of that distinctiveness. Just as what happened in France, just as what happened in places like Chile, just as what happened in Haiti. It's the same. The dynamics and processes are the same, but they're articulated differently because of the distinctive experiences of all of these places. That's the tragic thing about revolution is, revolution is like what they say. It's like, a dysfunctional family, right? They're all in many cases the same, but they're all in many ways different too. And in many ways, that's what revolution is. Revolutionary process is, I think, it just happens in similar ways, the same ways almost in all of these various places, but it's happening with different sort of articulation because of the different experiences and histories of each of these places.
So let me give you a specific example then that's germane to our location. That approach arguably reduces Thomas Jefferson to a rebellious Creole planter not unlike the rebellious Creole planters we see in other parts of the Atlantic world.
Which he was.
Does that diminish his legacy, or does it help us better understand it?
I think it better helps us understand it, but you got to also understand that the revolution itself, the experience of revolution was going to be transformative for everyone who lived through it, and including of someone like Thomas Jefferson, and that he's going to come out the other side. And as I put it in the book anyway, the best way of thinking about him is you just got to line him up, because he's doing exactly the same things Napoleon is doing and Simon Bolivar is doing. They're all invested in the same kinds of projects. But before that happened, that's indeed what he was. He was a Creole planter. And we don't usually use that term Creole when it comes to American history, but that's what he was, exactly like the same as these kinds of elites that are living in Latin America, or the ascendancy in Ireland or other sorts of places, or kind of white planters that are living in Saint-Domingue that would become Haiti. That's indeed what he was. But the process of revolution was going to be something that was going to be transformative for him and for everybody else who lived through them.
So before we throw it open to the body of the Kirk, as my Scottish neighbors would say, what's the takeaway? What do you want people to take away from this book?
That's another hard question. I think the takeaway from this book is this. And certainly kind of for being an American audience, I hope it makes us think about sort of like the American experience in a different way, not in a way to kind of refute what we think we know, not to just, as I put it before, just smash myths or something like that, but to realize that what happened to create this nation state was part and parcel of a process that really transformed the broader space that it was a part of. And I would think that that's not only kind of a prospect that excites me about Americans, but I think hopefully other people from other countries that were part and parcel of the age of revolution would come away with the same sort of understanding as well.
Great. I've got other questions, but I want to give people the opportunity to ask theirs. So John has a mic, so if you could wait for the microphone, please, before you ask your question, that would be really helpful. But please, friends. We have a gentleman here and then Professor Gould.
Wonderful. I'm so glad I came. Thank you for coming. The American experiment seems to have worked. Briefly, why did the Haitian experiment fail?
I guess it depends on what you would say failed or succeeded, right? Now, we could argue, and this is one thing I do in the book too, like a lot of people would say what happened in Latin America was just going to be a whole bunch of unstable states that were going to be created, and the United States wasn't. I think all these states, including the place we live in, was profoundly challenged to bring revolution to an end. And all of these places were still dealing with all kinds of tensions. And so, if anything, the American case, you could argue early on, was a bit of a failure as well. And the Civil War would seem to demonstrate that. I think when it comes, and this is the interesting thing we think about Haiti too, you could also argue that Haiti was the one place where revolution actually succeeded most fully, that it freed some people most completely. At large, it was probably going to be what we deemed to be a failure because of, I wouldn't say so much circumstance, but it was the way that more or less every nation turned its back on Haiti and completely isolated it after the war. And of course, the indemnity they have to pay back, the extortionist indemnity they have to pay for France for their freedom, was another part of it. What I talk about at the end, and this gets back to your question, Frank, about kind of like connection of falling and rising about it, is that every state that emerges from the crucible of revolution is going to be a place that's still hyper-connected in many ways, but it's going to be managed now by nation states. And so these nation states, if you will, consider themselves to be singularities, but they're more bound to each other than probably places had been ever before. One of the exceptions to that is Haiti. That Haiti, the place that had been most hyper-connected, after the war is going to be the place where connections are short-circuited because of the international community. So if there was a failure of kind of revolution as we see it, it largely didn't have to do with the Haitians themselves, who really, achieved a great deal. It had to do with the broader community they were a part of, not allowing them to have that sort of like that seemingly contradictory ability to connect and to disconnect at the same time. Thank you.
So let me just say, this is a wonderful book. I was privileged to blurb the back of it. And if you haven't bought it, buy it. It's great. So Pat, I've got a question. It might be about the parameters of your age of revolution. And as you're talking about monuments, and I almost borrowed Doug's book next to me to see if you do mention the Confederacy. Because the Confederacy makes a very strong claim to be following in a paradigm created in 1776. I heard a wonderful talk by Amanda Foreman a number of years ago. The brief period when Britain contemplated recognizing the Confederacy, they accepted parallels between the Confederacy and other revolutionary states. When you talk about monuments, of course, to bring the Confederacy in reminds us that some of these monuments to revolution have, been more durable than others. Some are more calming than others. I wonder if you'd care to sort of talk about that in that context.
Well, it's two really great questions. So the first one, of course, and the book deals with it, and this is going to be one of the challenges that Americans are going to be facing afterwards. So, of course, we know that in the early 19th century, the ideal of the American Revolution is going to be the way by which all Americans, no matter where they are living, are going to define themselves. They're going to see themselves that way. And we also know through all kinds of great work, of course, that people in the North and South are going to be justifying in the South secession, or justifying the idea of the critical importance of union, right, by kind of going right back to those ideals. And they're going to be defining those ideals and stressing different points of those ideals in different kinds of ways, but they are bound to those ideals. It's impossible for them to move out of that discourse of what the revolution meant and means as they're trying to create different understandings of what nationhood ultimately is. So that clearly is in a critical importance. But from that point on, that isn't just the American case. It's nearly every other nation we're talking about. That people are going to look back to this moment, and that's how they're going to be able to justify in their own present moments, anyway, what should be done or what should not be done. The issue of monuments was a challenging one for me, and it's probably a challenging one for all of us here in this room. And this is what I came down to with it. So I thought a lot about it, The monuments, of course, that have been toppled, that were put up, kind of in the Jim Crow era and put up in the Reconstruction, those are different monuments as far as I'm concerned. Those are, if you will, peace pacts, I think, as well. They were peace pacts that were put in place, the lowest common denominator, meant to exclude, to kind of, if you will, reintegrate the South into the nation after the war, but they were consciously meant to exclude African Americans. I think that to a certain extent, that peace pact is it's clearly run its course, and there's no reason, as far as I'm concerned anyway, to keep those particular things up. The American Revolutionary monuments are different altogether. But here's the interesting thing. Even those people who would argue that maybe some of these monuments have to be toppled, I'd assume you guys have been dealing with it probably at the University of Virginia and Thomas Jefferson and everything like that. The arguments that they make are rooted in the age itself. And I think to a certain extent, they're rooted in notions of rights that come right from the age of revolution. And ironically speaking, sometimes when we find ourselves having these debates, far from weakening, compromising, or attenuating what the age meant to American civic life, they can have the role of actually strengthening the connection between us and between the American Revolution. For me, by far the most important one in here, I think at the end, to kind of, if you want to understand the evolving American experiment, is Frederick Douglass. How Frederick Douglass, who was excluded now, is considered to be a founding father, with great reason, obviously, now. But he now has been enfolded into that narrative and really brought into that revolutionary story as well. That's one of the interesting things. But I also think as an American citizen, when I'm putting on my citizen hat, that's also one of the things I think that we can be most proud of, that we have, if you will, kind of expanded that understanding with time. And now we can allow into our pantheon, our national pantheon, someone like Frederick Douglass.
Thank you, Patrick, for
Thanks,
that
Kristen.
wonderful talk. I haven't read the book yet, Lige, but I will run and get my copy. I will. So, Patrick, I have two questions for you. One is that and in a lot of your responses to Frank, you invoke the state. And my first question is about, given that these states are emerging from the sort of ash, or the imperial ash of revolution, what kind of capacity do they actually have to affect the outcomes of these revolutions and to indeed memorialize them? And the second question is about transformative. Given what you've told us, or your agreement with other literature about Jefferson being, one of these Creole elites that in part the revolution, especially in the American context, actually reified empire rather than dismantling it. How was this age transformative? What do you mean by that term, I guess, is my second question.
So thanks for that. Let me start first. The first question, because this is one Christy, you've nailed it. One that I really tussled with, but that was really fun to tussle with, and that was kind of like the states, because you assume, as you put it, like through the ashes of this moment, right? But remember, is that it's armies are making many of these ashes. It's people under arms are making these ashes. And so there has to be some entity that is kind of placing these people out there and is sustaining them. And that in many ways is the state. If anything, the state's capacity increases through war making and through the process of revolution. And that's why I would argue that at the end of the day, nation states have the ability to kind of like manage and control the tensions that are unleashed through revolutionary violence and revolutionary uncertainty. So it's not only managing all the connections, they're going to be able to do that more effectively, but they're also going to be managing these tensions that were necessarily part and parcel of the revolutionary process. There's people doing all kinds of unspeakable things to one another in the name of the state, and it's only when you have the state is able to harness that do you have a state that has capacity. So ironically speaking, even though, by the way, when you look at the most difficult periods of time that I look at are when there is no state acting. That's when things get really, really dodgy. Those are like, this is no book an anarchist is really going to embrace, because believe me, having studied it, you don't want revolution. You do not want revolution, these kinds of moments. And so, but, it's the states eventually through this kind of process and through particularly war making is part and parcel of it, then they have the capacity to actually act and do things and change things. What is to change things? So what is transformed? Well, I think that this period of time actually creates our world. Okay, so what's going to emerge from this? Well, kind of older mercantilist, anachronistically we would call mercantilist understandings of kind of trade are more or less done away with. I mean, the idea of free trade as we know it really begins to start taking shape and taking off in this period, not just out of principle, but it's people like Adam Smith and then those thereafter are going to embrace them, like Thomas Jefferson, who is here, are going to embrace some of these ideas because this is just rationalizing the way that the world is. In other words, what I think is transformative is that people catch up with reality, with the changes that had occurred in the 18th century, and they come up with sets of ideas to make sense of that changed reality. And so one of it's going to be that people are going to be freer than they were before. You're going to have freer movement, freer trade, freer people. Popular sovereignty is going to be the rule, not the exception during this particular period of time. Even for those places that fought revolution, like Frank lives in Britain. He's a subject of King Charles III, as he loves to kind of tell me and always reminding me this. But as a subject, he too has more or less kind of rights that a citizen does in some ways. But I mean, Britain too was also going to be a place that was going to be transformed by this moment in ways. So I do think it's kind of shaped in many ways fundamentally our world, but even though I focus on thanks for calling me out on that, focusing on the continuities, I think there was some transformation. Yes, thank you.
Since I'm holding the microphone, I'll ask a question. I'm actually fascinated by the discussion of monuments and your discussion of nation building and least common denominator building nation. And I'm thinking another one of our former UVA colleagues, Johann Neem, who speaks a lot about the necessity of nation building myths to create a common denominator for the nation. And he puts this in very contemporaneous terms. We talk about the nation as divided. And he says that's one of the reasons you need this nation building myth. So I'd be interested in your comment on that, but then that begs a more complicated question. does that explain and maybe even justify some of those who would like to exclude things from our history?
Say that part, last part again, John, about the connection between the 2 points.
Does it, if we have to have these myths, if these
Yes.
myths are so central to bring America together, to eliminate the divide, does it explain, and I think these are two different questions, does it explain and does it justify those who are seeking to narrow some aspects of our history?
Yeah, I get it now. Does it explain? Yes. Does it justify? No. So you think of the people who kind of stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they were as bound up in the myth-making of the American Revolution as anybody else was, and they wanted to claim it all as theirs. I think one of the great things about American history is, particularly since the Civil War, we have been good at progressively opening that revolution up to other people and people that had been imperfectly included before, like, for example, women, or excluded before, like African Americans. And I think that's what I would consider kind of a really proud moment for Americans, that we have been able to do so. But the problem with any myth, of course, is that it's always in the eye of the beholder, and people have the ability to define these things and to try to narrow them down. But we as a people have more or less, we don't only have a pact with the past, we have a pact with each other about that past. And I think that's what kind of our understandings of the American Revolution are, more about kind of a pact with us to root ourselves in the past, however much we would disagree with one another. Okay, but at the same time, it's not just a simplistic kind of pact with what had gone on before, as we would selectively read it.
So far, we've only been talking about the revolutions of the 18th, 19th centuries. With your background, I would be very interested to hear how the 17th century English Civil War and Revolution would fit into any of this. Or is it just a totally different world? Because it's certainly, we've got an imperial element of that too, Ireland and the Americas. And how would that fit, or would it not fit at all?
Well, Jeff, that's a great question. And well, there's two ways. First off, I say that, of course, in the 18th, you would know this better than anybody, is that in the 18th century, Americans in particular are kind of using 17th century models to understand what is happening to them in the 18th century. And that's clearly one way of thinking about it. So much of the language that Jefferson is going to use is more or less, it's nothing distinctively American about it. It's boilerplate 17th century Commonwealth man language. And so that itself is going to emerge from the period of tumult during that time. So that's one way. I think, though, the other thing is, and this is what I would argue, is that it's not so much that the 17th century is a model for the 18th century, but that what happens to English society in the 17th century is more or less what happens to broader societies in the 18th century. That same process of sovereignty collapsing, the competition to reconstitute sovereignty, and then a new order emerges, is clearly going to happen in England in the 17th century, will be happening through all these societies in the 18th century. The two differences is this is happening on a vaster scale. It's happening on a vaster scale because of the robust nature of the connections that are binding all of these places together, because these places are so much wealthier than they had been before. That is another thing that's going to, if you will, it's going to guarantee that the scope and scale of what's going to happen is going to be a much, much larger age. You can make the argument about what the 17th century, what happens there is also going to be a bit of a crisis of connection, only the crises are not as kind of far-ranging. The sets of ideas that they're dealing with and the kind of the actors in that, it's going to be, if you will, the last gasp probably of the destabilization of Europe, particularly at the time of the Reformation. The 18th century is Eamon Duffy calls what happens at that period of time the Great Destabilization. We have a great destabilization of the 18th century, but for a different sort of reason. Yeah, thank you.
So if I can follow up on that, Patrick, does Britain not experience a revolution in the 18th century because of what happened in the 17th century? I mean, did it get the drop on the rest of the Atlantic world?
No, I just think they got really, really lucky. And what happened with Britain is, and this is important because of where we're sitting, its most radical appendage broke off before the French Revolution. So if America had held on So what's going on in the United States is going to be what's happening in France too. I think in terms, like I say, the particulars differ because of the history of the place, because of how big and important France is, because of kind of the size of that nation, the wealth of that nation, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, there's similar kinds of dynamics. But the difference is that revolution is going to occur in the center of the state. With the British, it's going to occur on the peripheries of the state. So all of the reverberations you find first in a revolutionary moment are first found, generally speaking, on the peripheries, is where you kind of see them beginning to play out. But because this place broke apart, if you will, Britain is very quick to circle the wagons early on. And Britain does something that other states don't necessarily do. They institute state control very, very quickly and don't let things get out of hand. That's another thing, is those places that are able to survive are strong states that are willing to deploy their power to ensure that there's going to be no disorder or chaos. They're the ones that, if you will, come out, well, theoretically unscathed, but they're still going to necessarily be transformed too. To get back to Krista's point earlier on about kind of state capacity, Britain, Prussia, places like this too during the Revolutionary Age also have to up the state capacity, because now they're fighting the French with the levée en masse. Okay, and you got to get all these men into the field. It means that you have to have a stronger state in order to do so. So they're graduating from the period also transformed in state capacity. But because of that, they're also going to be necessarily transformed when it comes to democratic ideals. Britain will anyway, clearly. You know, but yeah, anyway, that's what I would say. Great question.
I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Oh, now we have an expert now, Armin.
Well,
Yes.
maybe it's a very unexpert question. So
No.
why the age of Atlantic revolutions and not just the age of revolutions? So what I mean with that is, as Palmer, Bailey, Gaudichaud conceived of it, it was a way to take American history out of the previous American consensus, American exceptionalism, frontier thesis, historiography, and put it in a larger context. And since then it has grown. You mentioned Haiti, but already Palmer talked a lot about Italy, Poland. You apparently talk a lot about Chile, all countries that are not exactly on the Atlantic. So what role does the Atlantic specifically play for you to warrant a place in the title?
Well, thanks for that question, Armin. And well, one is my editor. That's it, you know, that, but that's the most important one. No, but what I'm at pains to say is that even places that are relatively far away from the Atlantic are all bound into these dynamics that are centered on the Atlantic. The Atlantic is going to allow some states, some of these empires, to really have greater war-making capacity than others. And when they're involved in warfare on the continent, their ability to tap into kind of the goods that are produced from their expanding colonies and from all this trade and all this connection is going to change power dynamics on the continent of Europe, as one example. And so what happens in Europe then necessarily is other states like Austria, like Prussia, they have to remake themselves if they're going to compete. So even though it's happening because of what's happening on the continent itself, they're still bound up into the same kinds of projects these powers with ultramarine empires necessarily have. And so much of what happens then is going to be bound into those Atlantic dynamics. But it doesn't only occur there. It also occurs in Africa. Places far, far removed from the ocean now are also being transformed. And how new states are being formed, new empires are being formed because of what's happening on the western edge of Africa itself. So I take like Pekka Hämäläinen's work and talking about the Lakota, the Comanche, and basically say too that you can only understand this as being, if you will, something that's an implication of what's going on in the Atlantic world. Without kind of a strong state that's developing the East because of revolution, you don't have that billiard ball effect that's going to lend itself to the creation of these inland empires later on. And so, as I put in the book at one point, if you want to understand Prussia and you want to understand like the Sioux, the Lakota Sioux, realize that they are states that are very much alike because as states, they are created by these same dynamics that are focused and centered on the Atlantic itself. Thank you, Armin, for the question.
Well, thank you all. And first of all, hope you all join me in thanking Patrick and Frank for joining us today. but I do have 3 commercials. You know, it's like, this is a free event, but it's like watching 3D TV. You know, there are commercials that come with it. So 3 very important commercials. First, I hope you all join us tomorrow evening for the Thomas Jefferson Foundation lecture at the University of Virginia, the title of which is The Man Who Built Jefferson's World, Yankee Sullivan and the Making of a Global System, by an extraordinary scholar, Patrick Griffin. So that will be at UVA Special Collections tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and I hope you'll join us for that as well. Second, I was fascinated. I hadn't expected this commercial, but heard Frank and Patrick start off with talking about very early Atlantic history, the idea of Atlantic history, and R.R. Palmer and Gottschalk. University of Virginia Press is coming out with a book in August called The European Friends of the American Revolution, which is from a conference in 2015 by the Sons of the American Revolution dedicated to Palmer and Gottschalk's forming of the idea of Atlantic history and bringing the idea of Atlantic history forward. So we may have an opportunity.
I'm blurbing it.
Well, good.
Yes.
Because I'm editor of this.
Yes, exactly.
We appreciate it.
Well done. I loved it.
We appreciate
Yeah.
that. Third commercial, equally important, is if you would like to buy Patrick's book. It is for sale up on the upper floor by our bookshop, and I'm sure that Patrick, after he signs mine, would be happy to sign it for you. So thank you all for coming, and we hope we'll see you tomorrow at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation lecture.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate your time.